I'm Graham Hancock, and I'm an author. I've been making my living as an author for the best part of the last 30 years. And for the last 25 years, I've been known for two particular areas of inquiry. One is the possibility that there has been a lost civilization going way back, more than 12,000 years into the past, a lost civilization, an advanced civilization of the last ice age. And my best known book, Fingerprints of the Gods, is on that subject. And my new book, just published on the 10th of September in the UK, Magicians of the Gods, is a sequel to Fingerprints of the Gods. My other parallel area of inquiry concerns visionary experiences, altered states of consciousness, psychedelics, and their role in the human story. Right now we live in a society that demonizes psychedelics, presents them as trivial experiences, you know, quote unquote, your brain on drugs, and nothing more to it than that. But if we go back into the past and take a cross-cultural perspective on this, we find that psychedelics have been highly valued in the past, and that they played a key role in ancient art and ancient architecture, and in the evolution of modern human behavior. And this role is neglected. People are not reporting on this. We've just all bought in to the model that is pumped at us through the so-called war on drugs, which in my view is an evil and wicked enterprise that should immediately be stopped. We're buying the ideology of the war on drugs, and we're not considering the amazing potential of psychedelics for healing and for exploring the mysteries of consciousness. So I have a parallel interest in this subject, and I published a book in 2005 called Supernatural: Meetings with the Ancient Teachers of Mankind, which is a deep exploration of the role of psychedelics in the human past. Okay. It's intriguing when we look at the fossil record. The last common ancestor between humans and chimpanzees is about 6 million years ago. It might be a bit further back than that. And really for several million years, as our immediate ancestors begin to evolve, we don't see any evidence of intelligence at all. It's not until about 2.5 million years ago that our ancestors start to make stone tools, the first stone tools. They've already been around for 2 or 3 million years, and they've made nothing, and suddenly they start to make the first stone tools. And they pass this on. So we see it going down from generation to generation. And what's interesting is that once they've invented these stone tools, they then stick with them without any change for well over 1 million years. And that isn't the modern human mind either. We're lateral thinkers, we innovate, we look aside, we constantly develop. This is a cultural tradition that is passed on but never develops. It stays static for more than 1 million years, incredibly boring, as a matter of fact. And that remains the case, actually, until less than 100,000 years ago, when suddenly our ancestors' behavior completely changes. Particularly noticeable from 40,000 years ago, when we get the great cave art in places like Lascaux and Chauvet Cave in France, or in the Drakensberg Mountains of South Africa, or a recent discovery on the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia. And all this art shares the same themes, the same imagery, the same patterns. And so the question is, and that the emergence of that art is associated with the whole suite of behavior that we regard as behaviorally modern. And it turns out that the art could only have been arrived at one way. I go into this in depth in my book Supernatural. This is an art of visions. It's an art of altered states of consciousness. In other words, it's the kind of art that shamans in the Amazon jungle today produce after drinking a powerful visionary brew like ayahuasca, where the active ingredient is the most powerful quote-unquote hallucinogen known to man, namely dimethyltryptamine. DMT. So we can see the art being done by shamans in the Amazon today, recording their visions under the influence of ayahuasca, and we can compare it with art done in the painted caves 40,000 years ago, and we find exactly the same themes cropping up in both of them. And the only logical conclusion is that psychedelic experiences inspired both, and therefore there is, at least in the fossil record, a very close connection between a huge leap forward in the evolution of human behavior and the appearance of psychedelic art. Does it prove that our cultivation of altered states of consciousness caused that leap forward? No, not necessarily, but it correlates with it. And I'm personally of the opinion that it did cause it. And here I need to pay tribute to the amazing work of Terence McKenna, his foresight, his intuition in The Food of the Gods, that psychedelics had played a massive role in making us what we are today, a role that we are now ignoring at our peril. I first became aware of the ayahuasca brew in 2003. And it happened this way. I had done a series of books on the investigation into the possibility of a lost civilization. Fingerprints of the Gods, Keeper of Genesis, Heaven's Mirror, Underworld, published in 2002. And I reached a point in 2002 where I felt that I had said everything I wanted to say on that subject. The reason I've written a new book about it now is that new evidence has come out since then. But in 2002 I thought, okay, done that. I've walked the walk for more than a decade. I've put the evidence out there and I want to do something else. And I thought I wanted to look at the mystery of human origins. Then I started to do the background research into the mystery of human origins. And that's when I found this anomaly that we have this incredibly boring behavior amongst our ancestors. I mean, they are just indescribably dull. You could not sit down for a minute with these people. They would just bore you just by looking at them. Yeah? And then there's this sudden change. And we suddenly recognize ourselves in the fossil record, and we weren't there before, but yet we were anatomically modern. That's the puzzle. The hardware was already in place. 200,000 years ago, you have fully anatomically modern human skeletal remains. But their behavior is little different from the behavior of ape men 2.5 million years ago. So the hardware's there, but the software is not in place. And then it's like the software engages really strongly somewhere about 40,000 years ago, and the whole suite of modern human behavior switches on, and that is absolutely directly associated with the evidence that our ancestors were using psychedelics, and it cannot be separated from that. And we are in denial about that as a society at the moment, and we need to get to grips with that and change it, in my view. Well, my work, my background is in journalism. I used to be a journalist. I want to be clear about that. I don't claim to be some kind of scientist or archaeologist. No, I'm not. I'm a writer. I'm a journalist. You know, I go way back in journalism, right back to the 1970s when I made my living from journalism rather than from writing books. And as a journalist, I do observe that standards in journalism are slipping in the modern world, particularly in the mainstream newspapers. But as a journalist, I believe it's my responsibility to experience directly what I'm talking about. For example, my book Underworld was described the phenomenon of submerged ruins all around the world, that rising sea levels appear to have covered many, many structures. I couldn't have written that book if I hadn't done 6 years of scuba diving. I can't talk about stuff underwater and not go underwater myself. I can't just sit in an armchair and write about it. I got to do it. And when it became clear that psychedelics had played a key role in the emergence of modern human behavior, and that's what I was really going to end up writing about, obviously I had to have that experience. I was proposing that shamans had cultivated visionary experiences using psychedelic fungi or plants or other techniques for getting into altered states of consciousness, and that they had documented these experiences in art. Then, as I'm researching, I discovered that in the Amazon jungle there are today, not 30,000 years ago, but today, shamans who are taking a powerful psychedelic brew, ayahuasca, and are documenting their visionary experiences in the form of paintings. So at that point it became obvious I had to go to the Amazon and drink ayahuasca. Otherwise I could not write authentically about this subject. I had to experience I had to put myself in the story. So I did. And initially it was a research project for me. This is research I need to do if I'm going to authentically write this book. But after that, it became much more than that. I found the ayahuasca experience, while sometimes disturbing and physically often very uncomfortable, I found it so valuable to me that it was teaching me lessons about myself, aspects of my own behavior that I needed to work on and needed to change, that I'd been ignoring, and that it was also opening up a whole new perspective on the nature of reality to me, that I didn't feel I was done with it yet, that I had more lessons to learn. As a matter of fact, in the Amazon, that's what they call ayahuasca. They call it a school. They call it a teacher. And if you find a good teacher, you don't just go for one lesson. You have more lessons until you've got the message. And I feel that there is still more for me to learn from ayahuasca. So I try to have a number of ayahuasca sessions every year, if possible. And I have done so most years since 2003.
Okay. How did it taste, and what was the smell of the brew like?
Okay, so I would ask you to summon up in your imagination a mixture of foul old socks, raw sewage, some battery acid, sulfur, and just a hint of chocolate. Put all those together, and that is the shudderingly ghastly taste of ayahuasca. And what happens next is, after about 45 minutes, you're hit with the gastric effects, the vomiting and the diarrhea. And those of us reared in the Western tradition, particularly Brits, we're very inhibited about our bodily functions. And ayahuasca is typically done in a group setting. You're typically drinking it with a dozen other people. You may be sitting out in the jungle in a circle, but sooner or later you're going to have to leap up, pull down your pants and go behind a tree. And that's difficult for Brits, It was difficult for me, that other people would hear me, might even see me. It became very urgent. They call it the purge in the Amazon. That's one of the names for ayahuasca, is the purge. As well as being a school, it's a purge. And these are, but this was the first lesson that ayahuasca taught me, that our bodies are not really the most important part of ourselves. What really is valuable and important about ourselves is our consciousness, and the effects of ayahuasca on consciousness are so profound and so extraordinary and so nourishing and so challenging that it's worth putting up with the physical discomfort in order to experience those effects, and deeply thought-provoking afterwards, that you're left with a lot of stuff to process and think through.
Could you take us through the process itself, with the ceremony the shaman did?
Right. Typically, the way it's done, the model that is used, for example, by the Shipibo Indians in Peru, in the Peruvian Amazon, is one that has been quite substantially exported to the Western world now. This is one of the things I find funny. So when we talk about missionaries, we think about white men from Britain or somewhere going out and bringing the good news, to uncivilized tribal peoples in some remote jungle. Today, the missionaries are the shamans. They're coming out of the jungle and they're missionarizing us. They are teaching their good news to us. And shamanic cultures of the Amazon feel very strongly that the Western technological world needs ayahuasca to pull us back from the brink of madness and chaos and destruction that we are now inflicting upon the world. So we have this setting where typically a group of up to a dozen people, sometimes more. Some sessions you might have 50 or 100 people. I don't like sessions with very large numbers of people. I prefer a smaller group where I can relate directly to the other participants, because the social aspect of ayahuasca is also important. So the shaman will carry out a number of ceremonial activities before the ceremony begins, and these are designed to, in the Amazonian tradition, to protect the space. You're lowering your shields to the spirit world within their concept of things. Be clear, I'm not saying the spirit world is definitely real or not, but I'm saying that's what they believe. I happen to think we may be dealing with a freestanding parallel dimension, but I can't prove that. But from the shamanic point of view, that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a freestanding parallel dimension that they call the spirit world. And what ayahuasca does is it lowers your shields and allows you to have access to that normally inaccessible realm. When you have access to it, you have access to everything in it, both the good and the bad. And the shaman's job is to keep negative entities out of the space. so that you may have a positive and productive journey. And that doesn't always work, and ayahuasca sessions can go badly wrong, and there can be a sense of horror and terror that may afflict just one individual or may afflict the whole group, and the shaman may not be competent to deal with it. These are issues that we in the West are going to have to get to grips with, as people with very little experience in facilitating ayahuasca ceremonies are now facilitating ayahuasca ceremonies in return for money. Everybody's got to make a living, but this is a very serious business, and we do not have the 4,000 years of continuous tradition that they have in the Peruvian Amazon, and we need to develop a tradition of our own. So, shaman, certain ceremonies to clear the space, often the singing of songs. These are called icaros in the Peruvian Amazon, and they're designed to, they're a kind of psychic road that you follow through the wilderness of the visionary experience. And then the brew is poured. You're typically looking at a small cup of quite concentrated, thickly boiled down brew, often with bits of plant matter floating in it, which adds to the nauseous effect. And then you drink it. I always hold my nose when I drink it. The smell is ghastly. And down it goes. And then you wait. For the first 15 minutes, you can amble around if you want to, you can have a talk, but pretty soon you're going to feel you just want to be still. And a lot of people like to lie down. Mattresses are often prepared for that purposes, and darkness is preferred. You want to close your eyes. Most often ayahuasca visions can be stopped by opening your eyes, unless you have a very strong dose, in which case they will be with you whether your eyes are open or closed. But that's one of the nice things about ayahuasca, is you can say, actually, no. This is too much. Please stop and open your eyes, and you can negotiate with the experience. The active ingredient of ayahuasca is dimethyltryptamine. Smoked DMT is a whole other story. You cannot negotiate with smoked DMT. 3 or 4 hits on the pipe with smoked DMT, and you are theirs for the next 12 minutes or so. It's a short journey with smoked DMT. It's a 4-hour journey with ayahuasca, but in the ayahuasca journey, there's more negotiation. You can exert your will a little bit more. So the brew is poured. You then lie down in silence, in darkness. Sometimes the shaman will begin to sing again, those icaros that help you. They're very helpful, actually. You hear it, and it gives you a beacon that guides you through these realms. And then the experience is yours. And ideally, you do not interfere with other people's experiences. You stay away from them. You keep your private space. You are part of a group, and you will later discuss and share your experiences. That's also part of the tradition. But while it's happening, you don't get into other people's space. You pursue your own journey. And the shaman may offer a second cup. And sometimes people take the second cup. I've taken it myself sometimes. But never be too eager with ayahuasca, because the first cup may not have come on yet. You may be thinking, that you didn't have enough, but actually you just ended up taking twice as much as you needed. So it's an issue to get into gently and carefully with some advanced preparation. Yeah, I did. One of the reasons that my TED talk on this subject was banned by TED was because I referred to the entity that many of us who drink ayahuasca have come to know as Mother Ayahuasca. And I was prepared to consider the possibility that she is in some sense real, rather than just a figment of my or the collective imagination. I didn't insist that she was real, and I don't now. I am open to the possibility that some extraordinary mystery of the human brain is allowing people who are not comparing notes and have no background knowledge of the subject to have the same experiences. Normally, when large numbers of people from all around the planet have the same experiences, we are open to the possibility that what they're experiencing is actually real. That's why they're having the same experience. Up till now, science has not accepted that about visionary experiences, but maybe what we're dealing with are substances that alter the receiver wavelength of the brain. Maybe consciousness is not just made by the brain. Maybe the role of the brain in consciousness is more complicated than that, and maybe areas of reality that are absolutely real, but that are normally closed off to our senses, become accessible to us under the influence of ayahuasca.
Okay, so you talk about the consciousness like that. Is that in the way you talk about like the TV signal?
Exactly. That with the default model that we have at the moment, which most scientists buy into without really thinking about it, is that consciousness is made by the brain. the way a power station makes electricity. When you have that view, then a lot of things become impossible for you. If consciousness is simply what they call an epiphenomenon of brain activity, if it's just an accidental byproduct of the material functioning of your brain, then of course there's no life after death. When your brain's dead, you're gone. That's the end of your story. You can't have telepathy. You can't communicate with other minds on the other side of the planet because there's no way that we can see a connection between those two minds. All sorts of things become impossible if you say that consciousness is simply made by the brain. But if you say that the relationship of consciousness to the brain may be more like the relationship of the TV signal to a TV set, in other words, that it's non-local, but manifesting locally through individual brains, that the brain is the transceiver of consciousness rather than the generator of consciousness, then all these things become possible, because of course you can break the TV set, but the signal's still there. You know? And that's an analogy, I only put it forward as an analogy, that I think we should consider and be open to. Right. I had a long relationship with cannabis. I prefer to call marijuana cannabis, which is the name of the plant. That relationship started quite late in my life. I didn't get really involved with cannabis in my 20s or in my teens. It was only when I was about 37 years old that that cannabis crossed my path, actually. And I found I liked it. And that was the beginning of a long relationship with cannabis, which went on through the 80s into the 90s. For example, my book Fingerprints of the Gods, by the time I came to write Fingerprints of the Gods, which was published in 1995, I was stoned from 9 o'clock in the morning until 2 o'clock the next morning, 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I was very functional stoned. I could write huge books, totally stoned. I managed the experience, and I began to feel that it was fundamental and central to my life, that I couldn't do anything without my cannabis, that it was the source of my creativity, that it was the source of all appreciation of sensual pleasures in life as well. It began to play a very fundamental role in my life. And that began when it stopped being something that I just did at evenings and weekends and started being something that I did all day, every day, 7 days a week. See, that's what you can do when you work for yourself. When you sit at home, you can put the volcano vaporizer on your desk and fire it up, and you can just smoke all day long. But vaporize. I wasn't smoking by my first vaporizer I got, I think, in 2005. And, I felt it was better for my lungs than combustion products, but that's what you can do when you work for yourself. You can smoke dope all day long. And I did, and it didn't demotivate me. I was able to carry on earning my living while smoking dope, and I was able to write long, complex, argumentative books based on facts. But as the years went by, I started to notice more and more changes in my behavior. It wasn't so much me noticing them initially, it was mainly my wife noticing them. That I was becoming very paranoid, very jealous, very suspicious. And it's true, I started to suspect everybody all the time, everything. Everybody's motives were in doubt to me. I always suspected that there was some dark reason. And it wasn't rational. And it led me to become a very negative person. That both I and my wife ceased to like. And I became aware that in some way this was connected with cannabis. I refused to believe, and I still do, refuse to believe that the cannabis was causing that behavior, but maybe that behavior was latent in me anyway, and it was revealing it. And it was revealing it in more and more unpleasant and obnoxious manners. And I remained in denial about that, and I refused to give up my cannabis habit, even though I had had a number of ayahuasca experiences over the years which had addressed that issue and had made it clear to me that I was getting bent way out of shape and I needed to do something about it. Then in October 2011, I had a series of DMT experiences in Utah, in America. Very powerful, the most powerful and the single most terrifying DMT experience of my life happened then. And that had followed 5 or 6 really great, healing, beautiful DMT experiences. So I wasn't expecting to be taken to hell on that journey. And then I got on the plane and flew from Utah down to Brazil, and I had 5 sessions of ayahuasca over a period of 2 weeks. And during those sessions, the whole visionary experience concentrated on me and my relationship with cannabis, and how it was hurting particularly my wife, and how I was not respecting and honouring her as a fellow human being, that I was acting towards her with suspicion and jealousy and stupid behaviour, and that I was causing a great deal of pain. And it was as though the scales fell from my eyes. I suddenly saw how I'd been acting, how I'd been behaving, the hurt and the pain that I'd been causing, and it became impossible for me to smoke cannabis anymore. Ayahuasca just stopped me completely. I came back to England. I actually I fired up the vaporizer, and I couldn't do it. I was filled with such a feeling of horror that I just stopped there and then, and quit cannabis completely for around about 3 years, just maybe 1 month shy of 3 years, when I was on the Joe Rogan Experience in America. I don't know if you know Joe Rogan and his podcast, but I sat down with Joe for 3 hours, and we often talk about cannabis, and we talked about me giving up cannabis, and so he asked me how that was going, and I said, well, after 3 years I'm beginning to wonder whether I could dip my toes back in the water and maybe develop a new relationship with cannabis which could be constructive rather than obsessional and abusive. And so Joe said, well, why don't you start now? And I pulled out a joint, which we then proceeded to smoke on air. And I really liked it, and I was able to hold the conversation together. So since then, very occasionally, without any obsessive approach to it, I have sampled some cannabis from time to time. It's great that the air of freedom is being breathed in some states in America at the moment. It's wonderful that you can go to Colorado and go to Denver or Boulder, and go into a beautiful little shop with expert staff and buy exactly the kind of cannabis you want in the delivery system you want. I would prefer to take it orally. They have very nice cannabis oils, which also have important medicinal effects. I wish we could move this way in Britain. I wish Yorkshire would make cannabis legal, in the way that Colorado has made cannabis legal, and set an example to other counties. But we'll never do that in Britain because we're so centrally controlled and everything is run out of Westminster.
There's no chance of happening.
I don't think there's any chance of it happening in Britain. But in America, individual Americans are voting with their feet. We have completely legal cannabis now in Alaska, of all places, in Oregon, in Washington State, and in Colorado, There we go. Completely legal cannabis. And more than 20 other states where it's legal for medical purposes or where it's at least decriminalized. So, America, which has been at the heart of the evil and wicked war on drugs as a state entity, that the American people are themselves bit by bit tearing down that wall. They're tearing it down and putting one finger up to central government and saying, we will make decisions about our own bodies as adults, thank you. We don't need the nanny state to tell us what we may or may not do with our own bodies. And that's a fundamental truth.
So obviously cannabis, I wouldn't really call it a hard drug compared to like heroin or crystal meth. But do you feel that ayahuasca has the same capabilities of weaning somebody who's addicted to them drugs, weaning them off that addiction?
Well, I know for a fact that ayahuasca can get people off addictions to hard drugs. It's been incredibly successful in getting people off addictions to heroin and to cocaine. The Takiwasi clinic in Peru, run by Dr. Jacques Marbit, is focused precisely on that. That deeply addicted people are brought out there for a month. They're given a dozen ayahuasca sessions during the month, and the majority of them leave completely healed of their drug addiction. They no longer feel any yearnings. They have no withdrawal symptoms. They've had a revelation or a realization that they needed to break that dependency, and they've done so, and it's been relatively straightforward to do it. So, the same thing was being done in Canada by Dr. Gabor Mate. He was giving ayahuasca to heavily addicted people, and then the Canadian government leapt in and stopped him because ayahuasca is an illegal drug. So really, they would rather give methadone to heroin addicts, which is itself addictive and destructive, than to give heroin addicts a completely non-addictive visionary substance which can transform their lives. Again, we live in a very fucked up society. It's not thinking things through straight.
So how would you describe the British government's approach to legislation against psychedelic drugs?
British government claims that its approach to legislation on psychedelic drugs is based in science, but in fact it's based on voodoo. If a scientist points out that cannabis is less harmful than alcohol, which is an absolute fact, that psychedelics are less harmful than alcohol, which is an absolute fact, and if that scientist happens to be in this case the former government's drugs advisor, namely David Nutt, he gets sacked. He gets sacked for telling the truth. So that is a policy based on voodoo, where if you tell the truth about the relative harms of different drugs, you get fired. What you're required to do as the government's drugs advisor is to buy into the prevailing ideology and repeat that to the public, rather. Yes, it's hypocritical because our society and the dominating forces in our society are clearly not against altered states of consciousness as such. Our society embraces alcohol, which, I mean, let's face it, when you have a beer or a glass of wine, the taste may be nice, but that's not the primary reason you're drinking it. Very few people drink alcohol primarily for the taste. Taste may be great, but they're drinking it primarily for its effects on consciousness. Ooh, that took the edge off, that kind of thing. I can relax now. I've had my glass of wine. So it's a consciousness-altering drug that is thoroughly embraced by our society and indeed glamorized by our society, even though it's an extremely harmful drug, which has huge numbers of side effects, health implications, and of course road accidents and fights, because the connection between violence and alcohol is really quite well established. We allow big pharmaceutical companies to make literally billions of dollars every year with antidepressants or drugs for attention deficit disorder. These are all consciousness-altering drugs which are authorized by our society. I think what they all have in common, coffee, tea, primarily, these are stimulants, they're also consciousness-altering drugs. I think the ones that are accepted by our society are primarily accepted because the states of consciousness that they unleash do not challenge the existing control structure of our society. Actually, we may be more efficient producers and consumers if we have a few drinks at night, because it gives us a bit of downtime from that, and then we can come back and work the next day, having dealt with our hangover. And the antidepressant, the depressed person may be rendered marginally functional with an antidepressant, which they perhaps wouldn't be without. Sorry, I just lost my track there. Where were we?
We're talking about why the government encourages.
Yes. So what I'm saying is that many altered states of consciousness are tolerated or indeed strongly supported by our society, but I think the psychedelics are singled out for particular demonization because somebody somewhere in the control structure of our society understands that they lead people to question the structure of society. They lead people to question the hierarchy, to ask uncomfortable questions, which previously they would not have asked, and which make them less fitted for the role that society wants to slot them into, which is uncomplaining producers and consumers of material goods. I think that's the reason. Psychedelics are seen as subversive. And you know what? Psychedelics are subversive. They do lead people to ask questions that they didn't ask before. I think that's a very healthy thing. I think we need to ask questions about the structure of our society that we live in, because those same figures that are threatening to ruin our lives and send us to prison if we use a psychedelic are also the same figures who are willing to press the nuclear button, who are willing to bomb other countries for some ideological difference, who are willing to engage in war, who spread pollution all around the planet, who stand by while the Amazon rainforest is hacked down and turned into soybean farms. The very same people who are behind all of that are also behind the war on drugs. Yes, I absolutely do. I think psychedelics definitely have a role in changing human consciousness in a positive direction, and I think we've already seen the evidence for that in the past, and for some bizarre reason we as a society have cut ourselves off from that trend in the human story. We need a huge kick up the arse. Western technological society is locked in a behavior pattern that emphasizes material goods and services and technology and doesn't consider other aspects of the human creature. Our needs, what it is fundamentally to be a human, is not just something that produces and consumes, not just a sort of meat robot. We have this thing, for want of a better word, that is spirit within us. And that also needs to be nurtured, and our society is failing utterly to do that. So we need to break those bad habits. I think it's fair enough to say that we actually live in a society that is clinically insane. It's an insane society. You have to be insane to tolerate 60 or more years of investment in nuclear weapons technology? I mean, here we have weapons that can radically destroy human societies, just tear them to pieces. A sane society would never invest in the creation of such weapons. It's obviously a mad thing to do, so we have to be psychotic as a society to have done that. And all the other negative things, the negative impact of our society on the planet and of future human beings, suggests to me that we're dealing with a deep state of insanity and unconsciousness. And I can only think of one class of agency that can change that, and that's the psychedelics. They have the capacity to completely change people's lives. Now, it's important to be clear, all is not sweetness and light in the psychedelic garden. There are many, many problems and issues. Psychedelic journeys can be deeply troubling and destabilizing. Therefore, it's important to look at the context in which we take our psychedelics. It's important that we take them amongst people who are experienced and do know about these side effects and are able to mitigate them and help people through difficult trips. In other words, we need to make these substances totally legal, and we need to surround them with wise, caring, loving advice. Then we will get the most out of them, rather than having them illegal at the moment and having them delivered to us by the worst human beings on the planet, by criminal gangs. We don't need that anymore. We just have to behave rationally, abandon the war on drugs, and find a new way to integrate these important substances into our life as a society.
So obviously you touched on quite a lot of this on your TED talk, the TEDx talk, which was unfortunately banned. Was it banned?
Well, TED banned it in the sense that they took it off their YouTube channel. But then they got so much blowback from the internet community that they went and put it back again, not on their YouTube channel, but in a little hidden corner of their website. Therefore, they were able to say that it was still online. I and another researcher, Rupert Sheldrake, both had our talks taken down at the same time. We'd both given the talks at the same event. They were very different talks. The only thing they had in common was this notion that consciousness is a mystery and has not been fully explained and may be non-local rather than simply confined to the brain. And that seemed to go against a sort of scientific diktat that TED has, that everything is material, that there is no such thing as non-local consciousness. It went against that, and they took our talks down. But then they got the reaction on the internet and they stuck them back in this little corner of their website, which Rupert calls the naughty corner. They put our talks in the naughty corner, and then there became a huge debate around them. Well, in terms of the visibility of my talk, TED, actually, I have to say, did me a huge favor by banning it, because that had the opposite effect from the effect they intended. They hoped it would just go away. Instead, it attracted attention from all over the internet, and that talk has been independently uploaded on dozens of YouTube channels, and at the latest count is somewhere up around 3 million total views across all those channels, which it wouldn't have had if it had stayed on TED. So
how did it initially make you feel when you found
It initially made me feel very bad and very wronged, because I had put a huge amount of effort. I'd spent a month preparing that talk. You have to do it in 18 minutes on TED, and that is not easy. Put a huge amount of effort into it. It had been publicly available, and then, as though I'd committed some offence, it was just suddenly taken down. So it was defaming me, actually. It was defamatory to me, and I felt very bad about it. But then I was just incredibly supported and encouraged on the internet, and hundreds of thousands of people around the world felt strongly that what had been done to me and to Rupert Sheldrake was wrong, and it should never have happened. And the level of protest was huge, and I think TED realised that they had actually made an enormous mistake, but there was just no way they could backpedal from that. I mean, in the end, it turned out that all of the justifications that they had given for why they took my talk down and why they took Rupert's talk down, they had to abandon all of those. They're actually crossed out on their website now. And they're crossed out because we insisted on that, because they couldn't substantiate any one of the justifications. It turned out that when they banned the talks, they hadn't even looked at them. They just felt that the general theme wasn't TED, so it had to be taken down. So they made up reasons why they'd taken it down, and none of those reasons held water. So we have it now, a permanent record on the TED website, their objections crossed out and our refutations underneath them.
So do you feel it's important to have the freedom to control our own consciousness with plants?
I think it's extremely important that we as adults have the freedom to make decisions about and to control our own consciousness, including the right to use visionary plants and substances. I think if we're not free to make that choice, then freedom has no meaning in our society. because that is what human beings are. We are consciousness. And if our consciousness, the most intimate, the most personal, the most sapient, the most, I would go to say, sacred part of ourselves, is actually controlled by other people, then I'm sorry, we're not free. And that's how it is at the moment. Our society claims to control the consciousness of its citizens, that there are certain experiences which are denied to us, even though they don't involve causing any harm to others. See, if harm was being caused to others, we have a different issue, but that's not the case here. These are internal experiences, and we already have laws that deal with causing harm to others, and those laws are perfectly good and practical and in place. And if, under the influence of a visionary substance, we cause harm to others, laws exist to deal with us. But there is no justification for creating a whole category of laws that are purely designed to limit the conscious experiences that we may have. This is a bad mistake. It's philosophical error that our society is making. We pride ourselves on individual freedom. That's, if anything, the West has brought to the world. It's the notion of individual freedom. And yet at the heart of Western societies is this rot, where governments and big corporations claim to have the right to tell us what we may or may not experience with our own consciousness while doing no harm to others. That's terribly wrong. It's a huge abuse of human rights, and it needs to be recognized as such.
So would you say that psychedelics are kind of a threat to Western capitalism?
I would say that psychedelics are a threat to the whole Western model of how things are done. And it's a threat we need right now, because the Western model is in many ways bankrupt and it isn't working anymore. And it's gone from being an engine of progress to being an engine for destruction in the world. And something needs to change. So it needs to be questioned, and anything that leads to an intelligent and cogent questioning of that should be encouraged, in my view.
Okay, so aside from ayahuasca and DMT, what other psychedelic drugs which can potentially change your consciousness have you used in the past?
Psilocybin and iboga, which is from Central Africa. The active extract from that is called ibogaine. One can go to Central Africa and sit down with shamans and eat the root bark of the plant that enables men to see the dead, which is what the iboga plant is called, or you can have the active ingredient in a pill, which is what I chose to do here in the UK. I did go to the Amazon to research ayahuasca, but I didn't go to Central Africa to research iboga, and I'm in no rush to do so, because the 48 hours of acute physical stress that iboga caused me are not an ordeal that I would wish to quickly repeat.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about iboga. It's like methamphetamine kind of stimulant.
I don't regard it as a stimulant. It's definitely a visionary agent, but it breaks you physically. 48 hours, it doesn't let up. You're 48 hours of being literally broken apart. That's what it felt like to me. I had some positive experiences under iboga, but I find ayahuasca, despite its physical drawbacks, I find it a much more friendly plant mixture to work with.
I've seen like a lot of comparisons on the internet, so like trivial ones like ayahuasca versus iboga, and like people talking about pros and cons, but they don't really seem that comparable.
No, they're very different at the realm of experience. Ayahuasca is this seamlessly convincing parallel realm where you are occasionally distracted by the physical problems in your body. Iboga for me is huge physical problems in my body, which I'm occasionally distracted from by some visionary experiences.
And psilocybin, how do you feel that?
Well, psilocybin is rightly described as orally active DMT. See, DMT is not normally orally active. That's why most people who experience DMT in the West have smoked it. Then it goes straight to the brain, crosses the blood-brain barrier. But taken orally, it normally doesn't have any effect, and that's because of the enzyme monoamine oxidase in the gut, which destroys DMT on contact. So the reason we have orally active DMT in ayahuasca is that the ayahuasca vine happens to contain a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So it shuts down the enzyme in the gut and allows the DMT to be absorbed orally. We're dealing then with a substance that has to be activated in the gut. With psilocybin, you effectively have orally active DMT. It's very closely related to DMT at the molecular level, and it's not invalidated by an enzyme in the gut. So it's very, very interesting in the way that it works. I personally have not had really what I would call peak experiences with psilocybin in the way that I have had with DMT and ayahuasca, but I suspect that that's just a matter of dose, and I just need to toughen up and take more mushrooms.
So that knowledge to make the ayahuasca brew with the inhibitor, which makes it to be able to be taken orally, is that like being passed down through thousands of years?
That's been passed down for thousands of years, and it's interesting to talk to shamans in the Amazon about it, because you ask them, there's an awful lot of plants in the Amazon. You need to put 2 of them together to make the ayahuasca brew. How did you figure that out? And they all say, our ancestors were taught this knowledge by the spirits. And then you start to wonder, now, okay, so if ayahuasca is the way that they gain access to the spirit world, but how were they then taught by the spirits before they had ayahuasca? How were they taught to make it? And the answer is that there are a number of plants in the Amazon that will give you the full-fledged DMT experience simply by snorting them. There are DMT snuffs in the Amazon, and that's the most likely way that shamans in the past. We have archaeological evidence for the use of ayahuasca in the Amazon going back more than 4,000 years. This is not in dispute. How long before that it goes back is not clear, but for sure it's been used for the last 4,000 years. So this discovery is a very old one already. It was made a long time ago by the ancestors of the ancestors of the ancestors of the ancestors of today's shamans. And what's been passed down is, in the tradition, is that the spirits taught them how to do that. And I can see the means for that through the DMT snuffs. I've taken LSD a few times. My first ever psychedelic experience was with LSD, and that was relatively early for me. That was in 1974, when I was 23 years old, coming on for 24. It was in the summer of 1974, and it was at an event called the Windsor Free Festival, which was eventually broken up violently by the police. I had LSD there. It was the first time I'd ever taken it, and I had one of the most amazing experiences of my life. I spent 12 hours walking around that place and sitting down with different people, and I imagined I'd been transported back in time. I had a wonderful adventure. Wonderful adventure. There wasn't a single downside to it, except my sense that this was extremely powerful. Extremely powerful. And a friend who'd taken the LSD with me had had a horrific night. It took him months to recover from it. And I got to thinking afterwards, and I thought, well, supposing my trip had gone the way his trip went, I don't think I'd have liked that. So for years I never touched another psychedelic again. It wasn't until I got into the research for supernatural that led me to ayahuasca that I got back into psychedelics, and in the extraordinary mystery that they represent and in their incredible potential. And so since then I've taken LSD again, but it's not my first choice. I would say my first choice for a really no holds barred psychedelic experience is smoked DMT, and for a deep experience with which one can engage and really learn stuff from, ayahuasca. I think psychedelics are absolutely linked to spirituality, and one of the things I sought to do in my book Supernatural was to demonstrate that if you scratch actually any of the mainstream religions, you're going to find a psychedelic or a visionary experience at the heart of it. Professor Benny Shannon, who's a professor of psychology at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, has done a detailed study of this. The case of Moses at the burning bush is a really interesting story when you get into it, and it reads a lot like a psychedelic experience. I mean, a bush burning, speaking to you, come on. Where do you get that kind of experience? Psychedelics still can reproduce that kind of experience today. And what Benny Shannon did was he looked around and he found that ayahuasca analogues exist in the Middle East, Syrian rue, Mimosa hostilis. The same molecular ingredients are available in plants in the Middle East, and he suggests strongly that the origins of the Judaic faith, from which both Christianity and Islam derive, are based on experiences in altered states of consciousness. St. Paul on the Damascus Road in Christianity. It's another, an instant of huge revelation comes upon this individual, changes the course of his life. And even the Prophet Muhammad in his cave, that this is being presented with the text of the Quran by an entity that he construes as the angel Gabriel. Well, that's an altered state of consciousness too. I'm not saying he was on drugs, but I'm saying that he was in a situation that is frequently used to induce altered states. A cave, sensory deprivation, hungry, cold. They will put your mind into an altered state of consciousness where visions become possible. And then, as I've shown, the whole origins of human human spirituality, where we start to see evidence for spirituality in the archaeological record, cannot be separated from psychedelics, because that evidence in the form of the paintings are the kind of paintings that you can only make when you've had a psychedelic experience. You're documenting what you saw. So I think the connection between psychedelics and spirituality is very well established. Now, often people will say, oh, that's a shortcut. That's the easy route to some kind of ersatz spirituality, not real. For real spirituality, you've got to work. That's the view. Well, I disagree. I don't disagree that you have to work for real spirituality, but I disagree that psychedelics are a shortcut. What psychedelics will do is put you into a place where you understand the work you need to do, but you've still got to do the work. If you don't take what you've learnt from the psychedelic experience and integrate it into your behaviour, then you might as well not have had it. And it takes a long time and a lot of hard work to undo a lifetime of bad habits and to reconstruct a life that's more positive and nurturing and constructive. And that's the message that psychedelic teaches. So for me, they just open the door for a realization that will then set us on the path of doing the hard work. The hard work cannot be avoided. There is no magic pill for spiritual experience.
What would it be?
What I would say to the government is stay out of our heads. Government does not belong in the inner sanctum of an adult's consciousness. We elect our governments to serve us and look after our interests. We do not elect them to dominate and control the most intimate and personal part of ourselves. So long as we do no harm to others, the experience we have with our own consciousness as adults should be entirely our own business and are not the business of the state. Stay out. That's my message to government.